I picked ransomware because if you think about the level of difficulty and complexity when something like that hits, it deals with the executive staff, it deals with IT security, it deals with the marketing organization, it deals with your third-party vendor ecosystem. It literally touches everything about a business. And so if you think about it from that perspective, if you can solve for those things and have more of an assumption that it's going to happen, it changes how you think about things, and I think better prepares you as a result of that.
Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. Join us as we explore the latest advancements and discuss how these innovations are shaping the future of security. With Jesse, a skilled recruiter, and Ramin, a seasoned security leader, this is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
All right, we're back. I know we haven't posted an episode in a couple of weeks. We've been busy here at Tech Compass, but we are excited for another episode of Securing the Future podcast. And we've got my buddy Brad Bell here joining us. Brad and I know each other a little bit. He's the former CIO CISO at Infoblox, has an incredible background, over 25 years experience in IT security, leading major companies like Sonos and worked at Microsoft. So welcome, Brad. We're really excited to have you on the show.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. It's going to be fun.
Absolutely. So we are going to be talking about really a topic around not assuming that you're secure as a company, but how this landscape has changed. And a lot of it has been around the ransomware attacks and how that dynamically changes how a security organization thinks about how to stay secure. And so assume that you're going to get breached, right? And then reverse engineer from there. How are you approaching security? So Brad, we're really excited to talk about this. We'll let you kick it off with kind of maybe just a little bit about what you see from your perspective on the landscape right now, and then we'll dive deeper into this topic.
Great. Well, thanks. I picked ransomware because if you think about the level of difficulty and complexity when something like that hits, it deals with the executive staff, it deals with IT security, it deals with the marketing organization, it deals with your third-party vendor ecosystem. It literally touches everything about a business. And so if you think about it from that perspective, if you can solve for those things and have more of an assumption that it's going to happen, it changes how you think about things, and I think better prepares you as a result of that. And if you look at, unfortunately, our industry is full of examples here. If you look at the Equinox breach at, I think it was 1.5 billion, something like that. There's Uber, there's Sony, Target. I remember my wife got her information stolen from that one. Colonial Pipeline. That was 4.5 million. I think they recuperated some of that, but the list goes on and on.
Change healthcare.
Yeah, there's just a ton of these things, and so I'm sitting back here thinking, there is just depending on the sources you look at, there's a huge percentage of social engineering going on through phishing and things like that. That's kind of a normal aspect, if you will, or a traditional aspect of getting into these things. But there are, unfortunately, an ever-growing number of these incidents happening all over the place. And I would say, well over 15% year-over-year growth on the major enterprise levels worldwide. Depends on the numbers you look at. But either way, whatever numbers you look at, it's up and to the right here. And what's also, I think, becoming more pronounced is the extortion kinds of things that are happening to people on their personal front. I don't know about you, but we've had what we thought was a call from the local police department. Well, it wasn't the local police department at all. They just advertised the police department for the local authority here, and through the discussion we sort of unsurfaced this. But and I imagine you do too. There's banking fraud. Click here to do this, or please call us here. They're obviously trying to social engineer you to respond, and the average user doesn't necessarily have the skill sets to determine that. And that's proven out. I mean, if you look at what's going on in that side of the industry, I think it's over a $5 billion industry in the US alone, and it's growing at a rate of over 20%. And so you've got those things happening, and those things can cross, by the way. So if I'm a corporate officer and I've got some threats for, reputational threats on my personal side, those things tend to can intermingle. They can use both against each other. So the landscape is overwhelming. I that's what I lose sleep on quite a bit. And I think, my assertion is that most organizations are ill prepared to handle this stuff. And some of it's a function of investment, some of it's a function of, well, I think we're okay because I've got a decent tool set. And so, but when you really walk through what it takes to drive resolution in something like that hierarchy, that ransomware attack, you really start to rethink, what do you need to do? And if you look at things like, data center recovery, that's rarely tested anymore because everybody buys services from the cloud. But I can tell you, when I was at Cisco, we had backup generators in several data centers all over the world here. And, we were up against the 100-year floodplain in Santa Clara, and it actually almost breached. It didn't. But unfortunately, we built the data centers on the ground floor. And before we knew this was coming because of the forecasts and things, so we decided to test the switching equipment, the fabric for the generators. And lo and behold, they failed. They had never been tested before. So if you apply that to, we have a ransomware attack, do you pull out your 3-ring binder? I don't have one at home here. I'm working from home. And what if I can't communicate with an employee because their self-service is down? Have I thought about that? What if email doesn't work? Do I have your private email versus public email? How do you think through getting people together? How do you think about crisis management, if you will, around this entire set of scenarios? And I think for me, thinking about it from that worst case scenario and saying, look, it's not a if, it's a when, and it's going to happen. It starts to change how you think about investments you make, and maybe some of the presentations you would do to executive staff and board around how you tie that to the company's risk profile in a simplified way and what that would mean to the company. So that's sort of what I wanted to talk a little bit about, was how do we change our mindset as technical professionals in security, and will that help, I hope it does, drive a better successful outcome in some of these scenarios that we talked about earlier that seemingly are continuing to become more and more frequent and larger in terms of impact. So that's the landscape as I see it here, and hence my desire and passion to make sure that as professionals, we have to help each other out. And so how do you share information, you share your experiences together, together would become better. And I think there's not enough of that going on, frankly. There are pockets here and there's some professional organizations, but I think, venues like this, wherever we can get our voices heard by peers and create that fabric of information that helps us mitigate risks together in different ways. I always learn something new from other professionals all the time. And that's really helpful. That's really helpful.
Completely agree there, Brad. You said a lot, right? So I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, and I almost want to kind of do it in sequence, right? I think one of the most important things you said there was, how aware is a company, and when you say a company, right, you're thinking the leadership of a company, its board, right? How aware are they towards their current, essentially capability in terms of dealing with a crisis like, whether it's a data center failover or ransomware, right? Kind of like a black swan type of event. And how prepared would they be to handle one if it happened tomorrow?
Yeah.
What have you seen be successful for companies that aren't, right? And, we're trying to empower individuals to start asking those questions. And, what recommendation or advice would you give that individual to, at least start that path?
I think it's a great question. I think most security folks already think this way, but, pick a standard. I happen to use MITRE and NIST, and that doesn't cover all the groundwork, right? So at Infoblox, we first or second week I was there, the sales team wanted to sell into the federal government. And in order to do that, you needed to be FedRAMP certified. And so doing that is a fairly large undertaking for those who have done it. And of course, this is on a company that we didn't even have basic SOC controls in place. Not that we couldn't do it. This is a lot smaller company than it is now, so we've obviously got all that now. But going through and thinking through, and this impacts product, but it also impacts the corporate side as well, with policies, procedures, and things like that either weren't there or needed to be refreshed and understood and rehearsed and things like that. I think picking some sets of standards that you can benchmark against the industry and assess yourself, or have a third party come in and say, we had both. We assessed ourselves, but we also had a third party via the P firms come in and do a independent assessment, which was also quite helpful, right? So how do you see us? So you avoid the, gosh, I look good in the mirror kind of scenario. And so it was good to have multiple points. And of course you've got, your normal scanning and things like that go on in the environment here on a regular frequencies. And in FedRAMP, those things are required by policy. You have to report on this stuff monthly and then semi-annually and annually. It gets a little more granular. But going through that certainly opened my eyes wide around the comprehensive nature of what that standard brings to the table. There were a number of areas that we spearheaded on both the product side as well as the corporate side. And when you're done with that, you feel a lot better, but it's still not good enough, right? It's never good enough. But I think going through and looking at picking a couple standards, and of course with the MITRE, you're looking at it from a different lens, right? You've done your homework on the compliance and operations side and things like that. The MITRE framework or kill chain, whatever you decide to do, there's a couple of them out there, helps reinforce what you've done from a operational practice perspective, because you're now acting as a threat into the company. You're doing probably the red, blue, and purple teaming kinds of exercises. Those are quite helpful as well. So I think, pick your standard and try to measure yourself against that standard so you know what your maturity is. Because if you're going to talk to someone on the board to get access to dollars to mitigate risk, they're going to want to know where you're at now versus our peers in the industry, because they probably don't want to overinvest, but they don't want to underinvest either. And they need to understand a simplified view of the risk profile they're carrying. For example, if you point out an average risk score against NIST, and you can point out the tool deficiencies and the dollar amount associated with that to get that to another point and tell them what risks are mitigated or reduced as a result of that investment, it's probably a high likelihood, given the stats we just talked about, that you're going to get that investment. They just don't know. They don't know how to interpret it. And this is where I think, as professionals, we need to get good at simplifying our language and really getting to the short story of the version that is consumable. They don't need all the details. They need to know what's the impact, what's the risk. They're all there to manage corporate risk at some way, shape, or form. And so I think that would be certainly something to look at. When I first got to Infoblox, we had, I think, one person. We had product security and corporate security, separate teams. And on the corporate side, we had one individual. And of course, it was there was a little bit of a tool stack, but no operational rigor, no policies, no practices, and nothing. And so there was a lot of work to be done there. So we built out a target state architecture. What does the tool stack need to look like to be healthy? And you can do, crawl, walk, run. So there's a journey. Because the reality is in a presentation to the board about where the gaps are, you have to match that investment with the muscle in the organization to act on those things. And so you can't
action plan.
Yes, and do you have the staff that exercises these tools every day? Probably not. You're going to hire them. And so you need to match those things over time. You can't just say, here's $5 or $10 million, go make it happen, and I'll see you in a month. You can tell me how it works. And that it has to happen over a period. So your job, I think, is to tell them what that needs to look like over that sort of lifespan. And if you're good at this, then you can take that NIST framework, for example, and take the maturity model against that and look at sort of what risks get retired or reduced and what's the benefit to the business over that time period, right? Because we know what the downside looks like. We certainly know our insurance costs are going up. So there's some fixed costs and then some variable costs, and then there's some unanticipated costs or risk-based costs that need to be looked at, brand reputation and those kinds of things. So that's a couple of things. I'd also put some investment into third party because now we're all living in a multi-cloud world. A lot of the stuff I built was all cloud based because I'm a cloud first kind of guy, and so we got rid of the data centers, and you need to understand what happens when you do that. And so you need to have an architecture view. What happens to the inbound lead generation from marketing into Salesforce, and they're from different cloud providers, right? And that some of that information may transit back into products for provisioning if you're a cloud first company and on the product side of the house. So where does that data go? How is it secured? Who has access to it? Do they keep it in resident in their cloud? Right? Is it secure? Is it encrypted?
You also need almost like a RACI, right?
Yes.
A RACI model that identifies roles and responsibilities when you're in the cloud. Because, when you're on-prem, right, you can very much, have walls. You can have, this is where my data goes. Here's my 3-tier architecture. But as you move to the cloud, where's your data? Who's got access to it? What controls are in place to safeguard that data, right? And the RACI model is different, right? Like if someone is using it might not be a technology person that owns that, SaaS service on behalf of your company. And are they, security minded? Do they think about what data is being collected, stored? How is it being accessed, right? So to your point, the cloud, there are definitely better, controls available in a lot of these providers. But then you have to, logically understand, how your company is specifically using them and make sure that you're properly protecting, the right data and access, right? And that's very complicated, and it's a moving target day to day.
Well, this is why I think there's a great marriage professional-wise with security professionals and IT. IT has all the systems and the backbone and the endpoint devices, and then there's the security professionals who are looking at how does data transit these platforms, and where is it stored for how long, and is it encrypted, in state, in resident, and all that kind of stuff. And so that's an important. A lot of times I see those organizations and many others. Of course, if you have, as you mentioned, someone doing sales ops and they own the configuration of Salesforce, for example, you need to bring all those teams together to have this conversation in some way, shape, or form, because, and probably, in Infoblox, certainly HR was involved, because what I tried to do was, what happens when Brad the seller becomes, Brad the product marketing engineer or something like that. My rights and access privileges need to change commensurate with my move in the company. And then we need to decommission the license for a whole other reason and rehydrate it for someone else in the organization. Those things all have to do with this notion of end-to-end architecture, which also becomes really important. When I first got there was no managed endpoints anywhere, and everybody bought their own and expensed it. So you had a heterogeneous mix of endpoints and no endpoint protection going on and no inventory control. So now obviously that's all fixed. But when you're a small company, these things happen, and all the more reason to start to think differently about how to attack this, and more importantly, how to create some visibility to this and the associated risks. Because all these things accrue to your ability to mitigate that risk when things like ransomware hit. As again, I use ransomware as like the top of the pyramid, because it's not about just endpoint. You're activating marketing, and there's brand reputation, and now there's social media impact. And so what's our philosophy as a company about how we want to communicate, how frequently we want to communicate? There's this saying that bad news doesn't smell sweeter over time, right? And so if your corporate culture says, look, we want to be transparent for our customers and open in things, we want to get ahead of that, that's a great consideration. But somebody besides the security and IT professionals needs to make that decision. That's a business decision. We can help facilitate it. And then how do you get together as an e-staff? Who manages the crisis front, if you will, on any of these kinds of things? And there's a bunch of policy things that have nothing to do with technology around that. And so who's thinking about it? Who's testing it? And that needs to be exercised regularly in a company. Because I can guarantee you when one of these things happens, people aren't going to be ready. Where was that information? I just had the review and e-staff, and we spent 2 hours on this, and I can't remember where it is. So I don't know who to call. I don't know what my role is. I don't know how to show up. So and as security and IT professionals, we need to anticipate that, right? Because, everybody's got a day job, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with a specific situation. And so how can we design things to make that professional response easier for that person to engage? I'm not going to remember what you said 2 months ago when we practiced this, because I'm trying to close a deal over here or something, right? And so how can I make it super simple? They don't have to remember the meeting, but they know here's the spot you go to for all that information, and we've figured it out, and it makes it easy to turn that switch on when something bad happens.
Brad, a question here, kind of taking it up from security to kind of risk, right? Justin and I have had a podcast kind of covering small business before, when is the right time to think about security? And, at the end of the day, it's, you kind of said it, it's risk management, right? And risk management isn't, necessarily like a framework, right? It's more of like a culture. It's how you think, how you practice, whatever it is you're doing. And I've seen many companies in my consulting days where, it's not that they have a security problem, they have a risk management culture problem. And you see, years of tech debt being built up, years of bad decisions being made for a short outcome, and then they never revisit to kind of pay that debt back down. Where have you seen, the right balance, especially in your experience, and, how do you give advice there, right? Where it's not something as, easy as let me go fix this antivirus control, but it's the way that a company thinks and the culture. How do you influence that as a security leader?
I think there are a number of tools that help with that. You're probably real familiar with risk registers, right? And if you get that right, you have a vehicle to have the dialogue, right? Because in a good risk register, you will have all these risks assigned with the implications, either dollar or reputational, et cetera. And so you can elevate that to a board level discussion on a quarterly, semi-annual basis. And it should be reviewed by the e-staff regularly, because those things go in and out all the time. But it's a place where the company as a community can drive a list of stuff they think is impactful, and what you decide to do with it, how you disposition it. Again, you're right. It's a function of how much risk do we want to take on board or not. And, there's a lot of factors in that decision that go well out of, it needs to happen at an e-staff level, because generally speaking, the board and the e-staff are the ones that are deciding what investments need to happen in the big buckets of any function. And so this is the chance for security professionals to get in front of the board and say, hey, we're a big bucket too, or a small bucket, but the implications of doing this poorly are significant. All the other buckets won't matter potentially. Right. And so you can't really avoid it and be naive about it. And so I think that's one of the ways to do it. There are others. But, I don't think the boards necessarily understand that, when you have an event like this, the complexity of that response and the potential impact of this. Sure, you read the news, but I mean, just operationally, if you were going to, be impacted from a systems perspective, those things are on average roughly 6 weeks to remediate. And the stats I've seen out there are those that have paid the ransom. 90% of them get hit again because they've paid that ransom. It's like it's a chicken and an egg thing. If you do, you're subject to more. If you don't, then you might be in trouble there. But the ones that do pay, 30% or more fail to recover their backup scenarios, as we talked about before. So that's a big number. And you're assuming I've got great backups. But hey, what if in your process of backing up, you actually backed up the very thing that infected you? And so when you bring up your backup version, you've just brought up that thing again. And so unteasing how to recover becomes really important, surgical. And the companies that have dealt with this, the aforementioned the list, they've all dealt with this stuff. And there are companies that can help with that, right? The forensics and how you bring things up and when. So simply turning on those switches is not a good idea. You need to be very, very careful. And I don't, again, those are things that aren't practiced well enough, if at all. And the smaller you go in a company, probably the less that exists in terms of practice, right? The larger companies have larger surface area, they're more complex, and therefore they're more subject probably to ransomware attacks and things like that. But that doesn't mean there are things that as a smaller company you can't anticipate around and build capabilities and at least have a lightweight capability at hand, because it can be massively disruptive. And I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, as we kind of get to the end here, Brad, one of the things we always like to talk about is like, where do you see, with all of the changes going, there's so many factors here that are accelerating the change of the attack surface for security leader and for a business in general, right? Like the attacks are becoming more complex. Like we talked about before we started, all of us, we were talking about how, AI, of course, everybody's talking about it, but this new move to utilization of generative AI is really creating kind of new scenarios on both sides, right? From, the company trying to protect as well as the attacker's ability and opportunity for attack. Where do you see the future going, and how does this kind of play into what a security leader needs to think about?
That's a big question.
I know. Best you can.
I think obviously, unfortunately, this universe is going to continue to expand. Those players are going to continue to try to do bad things. And I don't think that's going to change. And so you've got democratization, if you will, of these toolkits to do bad things and harm out there for hobbyists available. AI can only help accelerate their capability where they don't necessarily have the deep skill sets to do it effectively. You've got, I always think about this too, this notion of digital currency. Today, we can put sanctions on nation states, right? Because, the dollar's the standard. But when you go to digital currency, you can start to do a lot of things in the gray market and maybe not have that be as an effective deterrent. So what do things like that mean for our future as a nation relative to being a global citizen and trying to, make sure that everybody's living on the planet the right way? I think we're going to see, larger and larger attacks on cloud players, primary cloud players. They all have, very large security teams, and I'm sure they're busy. But I think, unfortunately, again, AI will be a helper on the attacker side. I think there's more expansion of methods and procedures around this, from, I mentioned the call spoofing, I had the police department kinds of things. There's more personal kinds of things. It's a hyper growth area, personal exploitations.
Huge.
I think, we've seen what can happen on the political landscape. I think that's going to come front and center here, if it hasn't already, very shortly. And, the deep fakes and AI will play a role in that. And again, there's not a lot of policy yet. Generally, policy lags way behind in tech from a government perspective. There's just not a solid understanding there. And it's just late to the party. And I think that's going to not change much, unfortunately. So we can't rely on that as an effective way to deter things. Generally speaking, I think AI will drive innovation on both sides of the fence. The threat actors are going to use it to help their goals and ambitions, and the professionals on our side will do the same thing to combat those things. It'll just happen at a faster pace, and we need to be prepared for that faster pace. How do you respond when things happen a lot faster? So...
Yeah, I think that's the key there, right? So to me, I look at AI like a capability, right? You still need to use judgment on how that capability is deployed and adapted, right? For whatever your use cases are, whether you're attacking or defending. And, it's a constant, right? It's not, a set and forget kind of scenario. I don't think we'll be there anytime soon in terms of the technology can automatically adapt and, be able to deal with evolving threats on its own. So I think, your insights there are very valuable, and, it makes sense in terms of, how to think about these things on a regular basis. And I could tell, I'm sure you spend many hours doing your research on what's coming next. How are people, dealing with these type of threats? So, it shows in, your conversations. Yeah. Any last thoughts before we go?
I think that it's really important to sit in the seat and just assume. I know it seems like a negatively biased thing. Just assume you're going to get attacked. But when you change your mindset to like, I'm doing a bunch of great things and it's probably going to mitigate the risk, and here's my scores against some framework. I think when you make the assertion You assume that you're going to get attacked. There are things that become more urgent. Oh, we didn't do red and blue teaming. Well, maybe there's a way we could start to do that. Shoot, maybe we should explore a way that AI can help us do that. Let's be open to new methods and procedures and ways to close gaps that may have been, expensive, human capital intensive, that maybe there's applications and things that can help us now. And I think simplifying the language, getting a regular reoccurring meeting on with executives, and really being able to talk about it both financially and risk-wise in front of that audience in a simplified way is super important. And making sure that when you have those conversations and you know what the risk register is, and it's a collaborative process, you don't own it, the company owns it, you may be the steward of that information, that you can tie it to both risk and cost, but also talk about the forecasted benefits and risk reduction as a result of that, because brand reputation is huge and customer satisfaction is number one. So if you can express it in ways that imply impacts to those things, good and bad, I think the board and the e-staff will resonate with it a bit better, because those are the areas they dwell in all the time and they care. Everybody should care about that kind of stuff. And this notion of crisis management, think about that. This is not a project, it's a crisis. And so when you show up, there's a command center and there's procedures and processes on how to get people to understand what to do, when to do it, how to communicate, what are the vehicles and articles that have been created. Yes, it's been tested. So think about those things going forward as well.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. And I like how, you kind of alluded to, it's an open dialogue for a lot of these things.
Yes.
Right. So whether you're talking to an executive, to a board, or to, IT professionals, these are open dialogues where you need to have them. And in order to, continue evolving, whatever it is, in terms of a program, right? You're always in the process of maturing it and adapting it to today's threats and situations.
Yeah, I always try to start from the bottom of the organization. So you can have the conversation with, the finance team, the controllers, the FP&A, the folks that are, doing the day-to-day. It's important that you have a partnership down there, because that telegraphs up. And then if you're the CISO and CIO, partner up with the business too and get in front of it, because all we're trying to do is be great stewards and looking out for the company in each of the functions. So if you can bring that mindset together, it's not a you own it or I own it, it's a we own it. That can create a teaming effect, resolving those things. And when you get a bunch of executives who are cross-functional in a room, it's not just one asking for something on behalf of their function. That's a much more impressive display of leadership, in my opinion, because you're all looking mutually at something that's really important. You all care mutually about the outcome of that, because we know it impacts us all.
Yeah. And it gets buy-in, right? Because security, at the end of the day, if it's just the responsibility of, whatever your security department is, you're going to fail, right? It needs to be embedded into everyone.
Yeah.
All right, Brad, I know we're out of time. It's been awesome to chat with you, and we appreciate all the insights you bring and all the experience you bring. And, you're very much a person that represents the security organizations and in your communities as well. So thank you for everything you do.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Right. Take care, Brad.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating.